Dissect every part of it, but let's start with the big headline. Joining me now, Alistair Campbell. He was Director of Communications for former Prime Minister Tony Blair here in the UK. Also joining us, CNN National Security Analyst Michael Hayden. He was Director of the NSA and CIA. CNN Global Affairs Analyst Max Boots. CNN International Diplomatic Editor Nick Robertson with us. Also Caitlin Collins, who covers the White House. Nick, I want to start with you. The context for this news conference the president just gave is that European leaders, NATO leaders who had been part of these emergency meetings over the last several hours in Brussels had been saying that the president outright threatened them, suggesting the United States was willing to, quote, do his own thing if these other NATO countries did not spend more on defense. The president in this news conference says he won the commitments he was looking for. The president said that every NATO leader will tell you, ask anybody, he says, these were successful meetings. I'm asking you, Nick Robertson, do the other NATO leaders consider these last 24 hours in Brussels successful?
Second day, a crisis on spending.
They're going to consider them hugely disruptive. They're going to consider them consumptive of time. They're going to consider them diversionary from some of the key issues that NATO has to talk about here, that they plan to talk about, important issues. It's hard to get all these leaders together. So they're going to be frustrated that President Trump has come in as a disruptor. And President Trump, in his own words there, has not been able to spell out any specific change to what NATO leaders had already agreed to. He again used that figure of 4.2% of U.S. GDP contributing to defense spending. That has been challenged. That's believed to be closer to 3.57%. So there's going to be a feeling that President Trump is mixing up details that they would feel that he should be more familiar with, that he is wasting their time, and that is putting undue pressure on them. Now, we will hear later from these leaders. We will obviously get more detail. He did say that the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg would give us a further update on some of the figures. But we've known and seen before how President Trump, and these leaders will have seen it too, uses language that at the best is ambiguous and often overstates what he has achieved. This requires a lot further scrutiny.
All right, we just watched the president depart moments ago, his motorcade leaving for the airport. He will fly here to London from Brussels. The president claimed that NATO leaders committed an additional 30 to 35 billion, I believe, in defense spending over the next several years. The president also said incorrectly that the United States spends 90% of the NATO defense budget. That is not true. U.S. defense spending constitutes somewhere around 67 or 68% of the defense spending from NATO nations. Alistair Campbell is here with me in London. He did, we believe, get some concessions in the sense that European leaders, NATO leaders, are going to spend more on defense. That was the president's main goal. He just declared victory there. You've been communicating, with leaders around Europe. How is this moment being received, Alistair?
I mean, let's just see what they all say. I suspect that he's gone in there. He's clearly kind of thrown his weight around, which is his way of working. I understand already that some of them are ready to contradict some of the things that he's said there. And I think there is a feeling that this kind of bullying, intimidating manner, it may give him the strength and the presence to go out there and command the stage there as he's done, to get, as it were, his interpretation out there first and to make people feel that they're on defensive. But I just go back to the point I made before his press conference. Is this the best way to build alliances, or is he actually trying to fracture those alliances? And so, look, I think he's, as I said earlier, I think he does have a point. He has a point about European defence spending. He has a point about the other NATO allies. But is this the best way, ultimately, to deal with it? And I think you saw as well that he does feel much more at ease in the way that he talks about Vladimir Putin than he does say about some of the European, Western European allies. I thought, by the way, it was interesting as well that on Brexit, he did seem to be kind of dialing down a bit.
He dialed down a lot. There was a moment of restraint there. He said, it's not for me to decide. We'll have a chance to talk about that more in just a moment. Michael Hayden with us as well. What about what Alistair was saying? This is not the right way to go about it, Michael. Again, the context here, we are hearing from the leaders, the NATO leaders there, that the president threatened to go his own way, to do his own thing, if he did not get his way on defense spending. Is it right to suggest that? Our Jeff Zeleny, White House reporter, actually said that a senior administration official told him the United States is not going to leave NATO. That's an extraordinary statement for a senior official to even make, Michael.
Yeah, it really is, John. And you know, it might be a part of the president's life experience where, as a real estate developer, everything's about the deal. But in international affairs, practically everything is about the relationship. It's the long-term relationship that people have confidence in one another. And although he may have made some marginal progress, but I agree with Nick, there was a lot of spiking the football on stage there a few minutes ago, but I haven't seen any points on the board yet. But even assuming he's made some progress there, at what cost in the view towards the United States from some of our most important allies in the world?
Caitlin Collins has been watching this alongside us. Caitlin, you cover the White House. I counted at a minimum 3 things that were flat out not true. Number one, when the president said that U.S. defense spending is 90% of NATO defense spending, that's not true. Number two, he said that Ronald Reagan did not win Wisconsin. He was the first Republican in Wisconsin. That's just a lie. Ronald Reagan did win Wisconsin twice. And the president said many other things as well. Give us a sense of what was true and not true there.
Well, John, really stunning to see the president there questioning what's true. He said that he's essentially declaring victory, that NATO has changed a lot than it was 2 days ago, now calling it a fine-tuned machine, largely crediting himself for that change. But his ultimate statement there when he came out to reporters in this unscheduled press conference was that countries have agreed to up their defense spending from that 2% of that GDP. But then later on in the press conference, he said they had only committed to getting to that 2% of their GDP, spending that on defense spending, which is what it has been and what those countries have pledged to go to that 2% by 2024. Now, that is a lot of countries aren't even close to that 2%. That is what has exasperated the president. But, John, to be clear, he is declaring victory here, but I'm not sure for what, because he didn't say that they've agreed to increase their defense spending past that 2%. He said that they were going to be spending higher than we've ever seen before, but it's unclear what or when, because he did not say that it was going to go above that 2%. He didn't say when they agreed to commit to that 2%. So to be clear, that was already what NATO was doing. This is exactly what NATO was 2 days ago before President Trump showed up here in Brussels. So it's unclear if the president is just trying to declare victory to his domestic audience back at home, and so he can move on and go to London and then go to Helsinki for that meeting with Vladimir Putin. But from what the president just said, nothing has changed about NATO, despite him saying that it has. He also made several other statements there that were just equally as stunning, John. He talked about that meeting with Putin. He said he does not see Russian President Vladimir Putin as an enemy, but he sees him as a competitor. And he said that during their meeting on Monday that he's going to talk about Syria, he's going to talk about meddling in the election, instructing them not to do that again, but not sounding very firm on what exactly he is going to say to Putin. But one key question, he was asked that if Vladimir Putin requests that he cancel military exercises in the Baltic states, would he honor that request? He said, perhaps we'll talk about it. So he did not rule that out, John. That's exactly what these European leaders have feared the president is going to do when he does sit down with Putin, offer him concessions like canceling military exercises. Several stunning statements there, John, throughout that press conference.
Caitlin, thanks very much. Max Booth, since Caitlin just brought it up, in regards to Russia, the president said a number of very interesting things. First of all, on Russian election meddling, the president did promise to bring it up, but he says, all I can say is, did you? And then I can say, don't do it again. On Ukraine and Crimea, the Russian occupation of Crimea, the president was flat out asked if he would accept the Russian annexation of Crimea. He didn't rule it out. All he said was that Crimea went to Russia under President Obama's watch. And as Caitlin just pointed out there, the president would not rule out halting military exercises, NATO military exercises in the Baltics. Your impression of just those 3 issues in regards to Russia days before his meeting with Vladimir Putin?
Well, this is very disconcerting, John, and it's very striking to see the difference between the Trump approach to our allies and his approach to Russia. In the case of our allies, he is highly confrontational and apparently threatening to pull out of NATO and beating the table and confronting our allies, whereas on the other hand, with Russia, he says, all I can do is I can just bring it up. What else can I do? He can't confront Putin is basically what he's saying. So it's a very telling contrast, and this is not going to be reassuring to our allies. I mean, in some ways, the press conference today felt a little bit to me like what he's been saying about his deal with North Korea, where he is taking credit for empty language that doesn't really mean that much. And likewise today, I think you saw something similar going on, where it doesn't appear to be any new commitment in terms of NATO defense spending beyond what has already been committed to reach the 2% level. And Trump is saying, like, this is a tremendous achievement. It's all him. The future of NATO is bright, and he's transformed it and all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, as General Hane was suggesting, these relationships are built on trust, and NATO is ultimately about credibility, and the credibility of NATO Article 5, which is the mutual self-defense provision that if one country is attacked, the other countries will come to their aid. Given this incredibly erratic performance where Trump was tough with our allies, weak on Russia, saying one thing and claiming going from being highly critical to being highly laudatory, it's hard to imagine that our allies will have more trust in the United States going forward. In fact, they're going to have a lot less trust. There's going to be a lot less credibility here because I think our allies, just like the rest of us, don't really know what to make of this bizarre performance veering from one extreme to another. And I think that ultimately, whatever his claims about NATO being strengthened, actually undermines NATO.
It's really interesting. Max brings up a good point, Alistair. If you look at the